Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone Season 1, Episode 1. It's called Shatterday / A Little Peace and Quiet. So this is the 80s version of the Twilight Zone, which I'm kicking off here. This is a Patreon sponsored review, so thanks to Cindy for picking this show. Obviously, I'm near the end of the original series of Twilight Zone. I've got maybe a handful of episodes left of Season 5 of that. But we're kicking off the 80s show, which is 3 seasons long. A lot of episodes, though, and uniquely, compared to the original show, these episodes filled an hour time slot, but the stories themselves didn't necessarily take up the whole episode. As you know, it was probably obvious from the way I gave the title of this one. This episode is 2 stories that are both about the same length. They're both about 24 minutes, give or take. And that seems to be the format going forward. In fact, there might even be some episodes that are split into 3 in the future, so we will get shorter stories. So that's interesting for a start. Also, it kind of comes out the gate with some big names. Wes Craven directing this. We have Bruce Willis in the first story. Now, Bruce Willis, of course, I assume at the time he was mainly known for like Moonlighting, perhaps. I assume that was already on by this point. But it's a good few years before Die Hard, of course, and he became a movie star. But still, big names, especially looking back. So, yeah, very different. And I was very curious to see what the tone was going to be of this, what the narration was going to be like, because obviously no Rod Serling. Instead, it is literally just narration. There's no piece to camera. There's no narrator standing in front of the audience talking to us. It's all just narration. It's a very kind of gravelly, like movie trailer voice, at least here. I don't know if it's the same voice the entire show, but certainly here it had that kind of vibe to it. It kind of affected the tone of the show, though, I'll say that. The opening title sequence, of course, is new and fresh for this version of the show. The music does kind of go into the classic da-na-na-na-na-na-na eventually, but it doesn't start off with that. It kind of builds to it and has a bit of suspense to go along with it. But anyway, that's the more broad things. Actually talking about these 2 stories here, I think this is a pretty solid first episode. I think both stories have something to offer. I think the second story in particular, I like the ending of that. It was a surprising ending because I was really expecting it to be one particular thing, kind of almost like a callback to a classic episode. And the Bruce Willis story, Shatterday, is kind of, again, very traditional in what it's doing for Twilight Zone, but feels like it's doing its own new spin on it. The plot of that episode, or that story, I should say, because it's 2 stories in one episode. The story of Shatterday is Bruce Willis plays this man named Peter who phones home by accident, right? He phones his own apartment when he's trying to phone someone else when he's at a bar, and he accidentally dials his own number just out of habit because it's the number he knows most. And he's surprised to hear a voice answer, right? He's almost just putting the phone down and he hears the voice answer. And it's very clear to the audience, especially since we all know Bruce Willis's voice, that it's just Bruce Willis. Not that it takes a long time to reveal that, but that's what the premise of this episode is that there's another Bruce Willis at his apartment. And he begins to question, who are you? I must have dialed the wrong number. They both give the same name. This is weird. He's freaked out, obviously. He runs out the bar. He calls again from a payphone, and it continues from there. What the episode's about, I think, by the end, is really obvious what it's doing with this idea, and that's, of course, that this represents one person who's kind of split in 2, and there's like an old version of the person, which is the Bruce Willis on the outside, who's kind of selfish and is still making a lot of the same mistakes. He's greedy. He's not got a lot of morals. And then the Bruce Willis in the apartment is someone who's a bit more matured. He's trying to make up for the past mistakes. He's trying to be a better person. And I think it's representing this idea of, like, as you grow up, you kind of, like, change into a new person. And this is making it literal by having the old version fear that he's been taken over and trying to get back in, but ultimately fading away because the new version is going to win out. So it's kind of like, even though it presents it as a thriller where the outside Bruce Willis is like getting really scared and is really sick by the end before he eventually fades away, it presents it obviously as a really kind of like tense, like scary thing that's happening to him. But ultimately, when you analyze the story, I think it's actually a positive story. It's actually a good thing that's happening. He's becoming a better person. It's just kind of embodying the idea that who you used to be is a separate personality, and that in some way that personality is dying by the new version taking over. So while that's obvious by the end of the story, it was quite an interesting premise, because at the start I was thinking, oh, is he phoning a different universe and this is an alternate version of himself? And then it became clear, no, they're both like splits of the same person. I was wondering, okay, what's it going to do with that? Like, because there was a lot of possibilities in the first half of this story about what it might do here. Like, what exactly are the two versions representing? Is it this case of like if they end up in the same room, which they do by the end of the episode, does something weird happen there? Yeah, there was a lot of potential, and then the path it went down was solid. It was interesting enough. It may not have been the most like wacky science fiction way it could have went, but I enjoyed what it was saying about the character growth and all the rest of it. I enjoyed the idea that the outside Bruce Willis tries to like force the other Bruce Willis out by taking away his resources. He goes to the bank and empties out his accounts, so the Bruce Willis at the house can't actually do anything. Turns out though he had some money stashed in the house, so he just used that to like survive for the duration. Because the story only takes place over about a week. It starts on a Monday and it ends on Saturday, and each day has got a different name. Shatterday being the finale of it, but Monday's like, oh god, what was Monday? Tuesday was Doomsday, and Friday was Fool's Day? No, it wasn't Fool's Day. I don't know. They all had different names, and like, they all came up with captions at the start of each day. This idea that he was trying to like fight a version of himself, and that was kind of interesting as well. Is like, how do you deal with this? Like in terms of like, okay, it's not about breaking into the apartment and physically fighting the other version. It's more about trying to get him out by other resources, by limiting what he can do and what he can access, and all that kind of thing. Of course, like he of course has a key to his own apartment. He could go back in and confront him head on, but I think it fits into the themes of the story that he's too scared to do that. He's scared to face this new version of himself because he knows this version of himself is better. So thematically, it makes sense why he doesn't want to just do that, even though early on you might think that why wouldn't he just try and do that, because like he would be able to get in. The idea that he's scared and he has to be sneaky, it fits into the themes. The other thing that obviously we get throughout the episode to sort of build up the ultimate meaning of it is that every time he phones the better version of Peter inside the apartment, he kind of like gives an update on like stuff that he's been doing to improve his life. He's called his mother and talked about how she's going to move in with him because she needs to be taken care of in her twilight years because she's not got that much time left, and he wants to make up for the last couple of decades where outside Peter, the Bruce Willis on the outside, he lied about like having to leave when he was visiting her, and he actually just went to a hotel for a few days before he went home because he didn't want to be around her anymore. It also sets up this idea that he has not had great relationships, and the Peter inside the apartment is like been apologizing to some past girlfriends and is actually fixing the current relationship he's in and hopefully making it work, and it might be better now. So it really sort of like peppers. I think over the course of the episode you get that it's less a mechanical science fiction thing where there's clear rules about alternate realities or alternate personas, or because even the characters even speculate at one point, like they'd be split in two somewhere, and they bring up a few ideas in like their life where maybe this is where the split happened. And you can still read that as like a genuine question of like maybe this is where the new persona started to develop, like because maybe an experience made him grow up a little bit, and that's what it is. But they're kind of theorizing as if it is just like a harsh science fiction split of some kind. But I think as the episode goes on, as the story goes on, you kind of get the idea that it's less to do with that, and it's more of a psychological representation of something, and that's okay. Like I think that by the end of the episode, that's solid. And I think the length of the story is perfect. I think I was worried when I initially saw the runtime because the season of the classic Twilight Zone that had the hour-long episodes it didn't have no good episodes in it, but certainly a lot of that season felt like it was padded. There was a lot of padded episodes. So this having just two stories in one episode, I think, is helping the pacing of this a lot. They clearly wanted it to fill an hour slot, but the creators of the show made this conscious choice to not fill a whole hour with one story. Now, they may do it at some point, but if they do it at some point, I assume it's because they felt that story necessitated a full slot. I think it's like 46 minutes in total or whatever it is for this time period of what an hour long slot actually translates to for the episode runtime. Yeah, that was the first story. Ultimately, you get when they finally meet in the hotel room, and it's like a proper passing on of like, hey, this is everything that's going right. I fixed all these things. I'm going to make up for all this stuff, and it's almost like the sick version that's been on the outside, who's getting worse and worse, is finally kind of accepting that this is happening, and he literally fades away at the end of the story, and the surviving Peter, goes out and just rides off into the city, and the narration sort of does its whole thing of like, oh, he went down a road in the Twilight Zone, usual stuff. But no, it was a solid first story. The second story, which definitely starts off a lot lighter, it's about a housewife, and let me just get her name here, Penny, I think, yeah. She is a housewife with 4 kids, and of course her husband, and this story is basically about how much they're all driving her up the wall because they're very loud, and the choices here in direction and how the sound is designed is clearly designed to make you irritated like she is at the sound of all 4 of her kids yelling and screaming, and the husband yelling through the door asking about why his shirt's ripped or whatever it is. Like, all of this is super entertaining. Entertaining may not be quite the right word. It's effective in getting across what the character's feeling, right? Arguably, it's even a little annoying. At a certain point, I was like, please, can we move on to what the story's going to be? So what that story actually is, though, is that after a few scenes of her, like, just going through living hell with all these, like, family members, is that she finds, when she's gardening outside, a box. And inside the box, there's, like, a pendant, which is quite nice. And she's like, ooh, I'll put this on. And it turns out this pendant gives her the ability to freeze time. Because she says, shut up, when they're in the kitchen again. Everyone's yelling at her, and she yells, shut up, and they all freeze. And that becomes what the premise of this episode is. She's found a magical pendant that allows her to freeze time, and then she says, start speaking, and then time starts moving forward again. So my instinct with this was that it was probably going to have a Time Enough at Last style ending, where she was going to, like, freeze time, but then lose the pendant and be stuck in frozen time. Which wouldn't have been a bad ending. Like, I'd have been fine with it. But it definitely felt like, oh, it could just end. And it would be a lot like Time Enough at Last when the glasses break. And it's like, oh, she's stuck in this. Like, she's wanted peace and quiet all this time. And now she's going to be stuck in the peace and quiet and regret not having everyone else around. Right? I thought that's where it was going. Arguably, it still has some elements of that at the end. But the ending definitely goes to a place where I was not expecting. They sort of seed something early on in the story, but they really ramp it up towards the end. That makes for a surprising ending, I thought. I like the ending of this one more than the first. I think the first story is maybe better overall, but this story, I think, has the better ending. So we see her use this, and I appreciate as well that the character immediately starts testing it to see, like, okay, what are the rules here? Because she freezes time and unfreezes it a couple of times, and then she takes off the pendant and tries to unfreeze time without wearing it, and it doesn't work. Time stays frozen. So it establishes very, very quickly, very simply and effectively, she has to be wearing this around her neck for it to work. Cool, right? Good storytelling. Making it nice and simple. We all understand that. The character understands it. We understand it. Perfect. And then we see her use it in some different scenarios. Also, she unfreezes time and she's like moved across the room. So the husband's like, whoa, how did you get over there? So it establishes that, yeah, when she unfreezes time, it'll appear like she's teleported to other people if she moves. So also good to know. So we see a couple of fun scenes where she's just kind of playing with it effectively. There's a scene where she's in the supermarket and she's fighting over a box of cereal that her kids want, but it's the last box, and this other woman grabs it first. So she eventually just says, shut up. It freezes everything. She takes the box of cereal, and then she just saunters throughout the store, just like humming to herself, like having a happy day. I thought she wasn't even going to pay for her groceries because, like, really, she doesn't need to. Like, no one's going to know. But she actually puts like $50 into the manager's mouth on the way out the door. And then there's the little bit of, like she contemplates sexually harassing someone whilst they're frozen still. She sees like a nice man in like sporty gear, and she ends up just like poking his bum. But you can tell she's like sort of thinking, oh, no, that's scandalous. I can't do that. But it shows that the temptation is there. The idea that, like, what can she get away with when time is frozen and there's no consequences? And then perhaps the more fun example of her playing with this pendant is when a couple of people come to the door, and they're not salesmen. It's like a man and a woman, and they're there to sort of, for a cause. They're there to, like, sort of raise awareness, particularly in this case for nuclear, like, arms race, and, like, you know, should we have nuclear weapons, that kind of thing. And it was already brought up in the TV earlier. She actually froze time when the TV news was on, and she was sick of hearing the newscaster talk about really, like, just scary bad things, because it was like, oh, tensions are rising between the US and Russia, there's political debates going on, and she gets annoyed and says shut up. This is the follow-up to that, where these two are going on about nuclear weapons, and she's like, you know what, I've got time, but I don't want to waste what time I have at a pointless debate, because they want her to go to, like, a town meeting. And when they try and push the issue, she freezes time, and she takes them out to the front lawn and lays them down on the grass, and then goes in the house, shuts the door, and then unfreezes time. So for the perspective of these two people, they just sort of instantly are lying on the ground, because he sort of continues his sentence as he wakes up. And it's a really funny little scene, and it freaks them out, and they're like, oh, let's just move to the next house. Let's not question this. Let's just go. I think all the scenes with her playing around with this mechanic were fun. I think they gave her different situations to show how she could use it to her advantage. It doesn't get too... Because you could take this story further and see how, like, dark does it get when she has all this power and no one to keep her in check. Like, does she eventually start getting away with worse and worse things that start crossing a moral line into, oh no, now we see her as a bad person? It could have went down that route, potentially. That could have been one version of this story. Instead, what happens is that basically when she's loving how much she's freezing time, she's in the bathtub, she's, like, relaxing for the first time and ever, the husband starts yelling because the emergency alert has come on the radio and the TV, and the radiocaster is saying that nuclear weapons have been launched from Russia and they have entered US airspace. And everyone's freaking out, and she's freaking out as well. She eventually freezes time. She yells, shut up, and everything stops. And the ending of this episode is her walking through the streets of whatever town or city that she lives in. Everyone's frozen. There's cars, there's people, they're all still. And she's walking through, and she finally sees a man looking up into the sky. And she looks up. And the final shot of this episode is the camera going up to this nuclear missile that is lingering above the city. That it's on its way, like it's seconds from coming down and killing everyone. And she just happened to freeze time right before it did. And it puts the character in this place where if she ever unfreezes time, everyone is going to die, including her family. Now, we could headcanon and theorize about what she might do next. She might, like, you know, we've established that she can move people when they're frozen, so maybe she gets a couple of trolleys, maybe she moves her family somewhere into the wilderness, and it takes her years of, like, this, of like, her time to do this. So she ages, like, 10 years, like, try to save her family whilst time is frozen, and then she eventually unfreezes time, and, like, most of the planet still dies. Like, that's possible. Maybe that would be the course of action. But that's what I was saying when I was saying it was kind of similar in some ways to Time Enough at Last, and that now she can unfreeze time. I thought she was going to lose the pendant. I think this was a much more interesting way to do it. I really did not expect it to ramp up, because the first newscast bit was kind of, like, on its own. It was separate. It wasn't until the two people showed up starting to talk about nuclear weapons where I went, oh, they're bringing this up again. This is interesting. Where are they going with this? And it puts her in this position where she can't unfreeze time, or her and everyone else are going to die. So she's now stuck in this. And there's no narration at the end. I thought that was really interesting. The narration was at the start and the end of the first story. It was at the start of this second story. But they chose to go to the cold, like, credits. Like, they just cut cold to credits at the end of this and let it speak for itself. So I thought the ending was quite impactful, honestly. I thought it was a much more, like, gut punch of an ending than I was expecting from a relatively fun and light, almost comedy story of this woman who could freeze time and unfreeze it. And maybe that makes the ending a bit more impactful. One of the things that I will have to say, though, there is other than maybe just the noise of the kids and stuff being a little grating early on, even though I get that that's by design because it wants you to feel what she's feeling. The main critique of this is that there's a lot of this which is people pretending to be frozen still. And this is something that I've seen in other Twilight Zone episodes from the 60s and whatever else, but it's difficult for it to look good. And especially since the first time it happens in this episode is a lot of kids are pretending to be still and they're clearly rocking backwards and forwards a little bit. It's just the suspension of disbelief's a little bit murky, I think, when it comes to this type of premise. These days, of course, they would do some trickery to make them genuinely still, right? Of course they would. The problem is you can't just freeze parts of the frame because it's obvious it's frozen, and that would feel like a cheat as well. So I get that they're in kind of like a weird place where they have to kind of pretend to be frozen still, but you can almost always tell, especially in a wide shot where you can see multiple people. There's always someone who's just struggling a little bit, so they're just shaking just a little touch, but you can always see it. And it's there all the time. It's there in the supermarket scene where there's tons of people frozen. It's there at the end in the streets where everyone's panicking, but time's frozen. Interestingly, they do a thing where at one point in one of the breakfast scenes, the husband's tie, he's sort of holding it up to the side, and that's when he's frozen. So, and it looks good because it's like they've made like a straight tie so that it looks like it's frozen in place there. But at the end of the episode, when she's walking through the streets of everyone running and panicking, there's one guy who's running, but for some reason, like half of his tie is just straight out. And I didn't feel like, from a physics perspective, it would actually be like that at any point whilst he was running. I feel like it would never just completely straighten, but maybe I'm wrong. But it looked a bit weird to me. Like they were going for something that just took me out of the moment a little bit. But not too bad by any means. Yeah, I mean, I think as a first episode as a whole, though, I enjoyed both stories, which is great. I think they both had different strengths. They felt very different in terms of stories. They're both kind of plays on things that the original show did at some point. Like I say, I've compared the second one a lot to Time Enough at Last. You know, I think the first story, there's definitely episodes of the original show that had doppelgangers, had the idea of like someone being taken over with a different personality. There's definitely some thematically linked episodes from the original show. But I enjoyed both. I enjoyed both stories, and I think the second one ended a little bit stronger, but they both had good ideas. The second one obviously is kind of this like be careful what you wish for kind of thing, and appreciating what you have when you have it. In fact, there was a point in the first story where I almost thought that might be the message early on, about like our main Bruce Willis that we're following, who's starting to lose everything. Maybe it's about him appreciating what he has and not taking things for granted. Maybe that's like maybe that is a theme that kind of connects both in a way. Even though the first story, like I said, is a much more positive thing overall when you stop and look at it from a bird's eye view. It's actually a good thing that he's improved as a person. It's just kind of giving you the perspective of the personality that's been left behind, kind of thing. So, anywho, that's my thoughts on this first episode of the 80s Twilight Zone. This is going to be twice a month, as per the Patreon sponsorship tier. So thanks once again to Cindy. Of course, you can support all the content at any amount you want over in patreon.com/MailFuzzTV. It's what helps me be able to keep doing this as often as I do. And obviously there's the higher tiers where you can make me watch something specific to your choosing if you so wish. But any and all help is appreciated. Thank you very much for joining me. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.